Hello and welcome. My name is Jeremy, and I'm here with my colleagues Komal, Neha, Sebastian, and Robin, and collectively we represent the ESDC RTO Implementation Committee. We would first like to thank you all for your time in considering the committee's proposal today. Today's presentation analyzes the federal government's return to office directives and the challenges involved. We will begin by providing a summary of the case study, highlighting its key elements related to identifying a solution. So without further ado, let's begin. Next slide, please. First, some return to office context and history. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, both private and public sector actors were required to navigate the transition from remote working environments created by public health mandates to pre-pandemic centralized workspaces. Some organizations capitalized on the policy window of opportunity that presented itself in the months immediately following the shift to remote work. Employees had not yet adjusted to working from home, and many volunteered to return to the office environment and their routines. However, as the years progressed, employees adapted to the working from home model, and the majority of public servants now prefer that their working models remain remote or at least flexible in nature. Indeed, 20,000 public servants responded to a recent Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada survey, with 90% disapproving of the presented return to office directives, suggesting that the pathway for return to office implementation has changed. The challenges faced by the ESDC include, number one, inconsistent leadership approaches to adopting the hybrid work model with less than 60% compliance rate within the ESDC. Number two, inappropriate and defamatory conduct on social media by public service employees. Number three, communication gaps between management and concerned external actors, such as the Professional Institute of Public Servants of Canada and unions. And number four, addressing critical gaps in RTO policy, such as space reduction targets, affecting service delivery in both central and regional offices. The Treasury Board Secretariat proposed two recommendations in their directive, namely Annex 1, which they sought counsel on regarding the immediate, short, and medium-term implications of each. The first step in the committee's task was identifying the root cause of these challenges and conflicts to effectively evaluate the Treasury Board Secretariat's proposed recommendations. Next slide, please. The committee determined that while problematic in nature, the majority of the challenges surrounding the RTO directives were indeed symptoms of gaps in leadership and workplace infrastructure that developed in the absence of concentrated workplaces during COVID-19. Traditional office values were no longer prioritized in daily operations of employees working remotely. The pandemic presented one-of-a-kind challenges requiring swift action in order to preserve and maintain the delivery of public services, and policy development was unable to keep up with the constant change to this public sector landscape. Taking a proactive and ethically responsible approach to its analysis, we determined that resistance to RTO directives illustrated a need for remote work policy adaptations that reflect public service values. This, in effect, was identified as the problem our committee would aim to resolve while respecting the recommendations of the Treasury Board. By acknowledging the need for a refresher in public service values, alongside structured and defensible hybrid work model policy, the committee was confident it would be able to meet the mandate. Next slide, please. Before delving into solution options, we examined risks of responding, as well as the risks faced by not responding. No response could embolden outspoken employees to push even harder for their personal preferences, deteriorating the ESDC workplace culture and compromising leadership's ability to manage its staff effectively. Additionally, disruptions to services caused by protests and limited ability to monitor remote work performance risk seeing a reduction in the quality of public service delivery. Precedent would then be set that the ESDC was no longer competent in its governance role, which could facilitate more aggressive involvement from external actors such as unions and inflame public perception towards government institutions. For these reasons, we deemed the option of not responding as not viable. That conclusion then required an assessment of the risks of responding to the identified problem. Accountability would be placed on internal management teams to address their employees' behavior and concerns, so adequate supports for those teams would be necessary. The issue has already received public and media attention, which means that any corrective action would be scrutinized as well. Disruptions to service delivery during policy implementation or restructuring windows could occur. Ultimately, we deemed the risks of responding were outweighed by the benefits of doing so. This leads us to the core of the presentation. What do we propose as options to unify ESDC leadership and prioritize the core ethics and values of public service? My colleagues will now present these options along with the criteria utilized in determining their feasibility. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for catching everybody up to speed. So now getting to our options. Our first option is part of a broader effort to reassert a cohesive public service culture during a time of significant workforce and technological shift. Option one involves an ethical approach to social media. Starting March 1st, 2025, public servants will face disciplinary action for using government resources or platforms or blurring the lines of personal and professional capacity in seeking advice or recommendations from the public on government policies. This is unique to general feedback mechanisms like surveys or consultations, which are designed strictly for individual input. Additionally, we will be implementing ethical space theory with the help of Indigenous specialists on the leadership team committee. With additional social media ethics and governance training through Knowledge Academy, we will be acting to reinforce boundaries on social media. Willie Ermine's ethical space theory provides a framework for engaging in respectful, meaningful dialogue between worldviews, particularly in our case, between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. The concept is especially relevant in public administration, reconciliation, and policy development from different contexts. The RTO directive assumes a one-size-fits-all approach, overlooking the distinct regional and Indigenous employment realities. Ethical space would advocate for flexibility and context-aware implementation of the RTO, ensuring that policies reflect the lived experiences and needs of Indigenous employees. By fostering mutual respect and co-creation knowledge, this approach leads to more inclusivity and equity. The first component of this option involves modification that entails expanding social media policy to capture non-government devices. This social media policy will outline expectations to behave the same on personal devices as employees do on government devices. Pardon me. In the event that employees do not comply, engaging middle management will be pinnacle, as they are the ones that are directly responsible for disciplinary actions. Within this directive, multiple groups of stakeholders are addressed: public servants, senior management, middle management, and the unions, with the general public acting as scrutinizers. Digital monitoring on handheld devices will require upgrading IT capacity, acquiring software licenses, and administering training programs. We are projecting this to cost in the mid to low millions. Next slide, please. Thank you. The second implementation of option one will require public servants to return to the office 4 days a week, starting June 1st, 2025. We see increased in-person interaction leading to improved collaboration and quicker public service delivery. This is particularly important for roles that interact directly with rural and Indigenous communities. The RTO initiative supports a traditional public service by reestablishing physical office presence and increasing accountability, which eases the operational framework. The RTO directive requires funding for significant infrastructure expansion. This includes increasing office capacity, relocation support, hiring administration teams. As part of the broader refocusing of government spending, we are projecting $15.8 billion over several years with a $4.8 billion annual maintenance, meaning funding may be made available for core and immediate government functions. Overall, the RTO aims to reestablish traditional service norms while balancing operational benefits and the realities of the modern workplace. The implementation of this option sees social media restrictions, maintaining public service neutrality, and the RTO directive improving direct public service delivery, but alienating employees accustomed to remote work. I will now be handing it off to Neha to show you option two. Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Next slide, please. I will be talking about option two. This approach proposes a more flexible and balanced strategy instead of implementing a rigid one-size-fits-all mandate. There are two elements of this option: social media guidelines and a staggered RTO implementation approach. Talking about the first element of this approach is developing comprehensive social media usage guidelines for ESDC employees. This is because the current policies, including federal government's guidelines on acceptable network and device use and ESDC's code of conduct, are limited in scope and detail. We propose that a committee led by the Chief Information Officer, Assistant Deputy Minister of Public Affairs, and Assistant Deputy Minister of Human Resources oversee the development of new guidelines. External consultations with other federal departments and provincial public service commissions can be conducted to incorporate best practices. The new guidelines would essentially define acceptable standards for searching social media, set out the consequences of misuse, and address workplace privacy issues. These will be supplemented with virtual social media training sessions for staff. By taking this approach, ESDC can ensure that public servants align their online presence with the principles of accuracy, neutrality, and responsible communication. Next slide, please. Now I will talk about the second element of our option 2, which is a gradual phased approach to the implementation of RTO instead of an immediate and uniform requirement for all. We propose that managers and supervisors return to the office 4 days a week on June 1 in line with Treasury Board's directive, while the rest of the staff continues to follow the common hybrid work model released earlier. Next, the managers complete the planned in-depth review of classified positions and carry out workforce adjustments under refocusing government spending initiative, and then call rest of the staff to work, depending on the results of the review process. Voluntary comebacks, however, are welcome. There are two key tools of this plan, the first one being a coherent communication framework for managers. This is because managers have a crucial role in effectively implementing the transition by sending out clear messages to their team, guiding them through change while ensuring public service goals are met. Another critical aspect of our plan is ensuring the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives for both staff and community members based on the ethical space theory outlined by Sebastian. It is important to consider Indigenous perspectives because these employees, especially those in regional offices or remote communities, may face unique challenges in immediately returning to physical workplaces. This phased strategy will provide us time for adjustment, minimize resistance, and ensure infrastructure readiness in regions where it is currently lacking. This is important as ESTC is one of the largest departments in the federal government, and over 70% of our workforce is outside the national capital region. My colleague Komal will take over now.
Thank you, Neha. So when evaluating these two options, we considered 5 key criteria: acceptability, cost efficiency, effectiveness, equity, and feasibility. Acceptability considers the level of stakeholder support, including staff, unions, and the public. Cost efficiency examines the balance between desired outcomes and resource expenditures. Effectiveness assesses whether the policy successfully achieves its intended goals. Equity ensures that the policy promotes fairness and inclusivity for all staff. Finally, feasibility evaluates the practicality of implementation within existing constraints. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of acceptability, option 1 faces strong opposition from employees and unions, along with potential legal disputes and public criticism. The recent surge in social media discussions, including negative posts on platforms like Reddit, has amplified discontent and made enforcement more difficult. In contrast, the recommended option has a higher acceptance rate due to its flexibility, ensuring a smoother transition while mitigating online backlash. From a cost efficiency perspective, option 1 results in higher operational expenses due to office maintenance, enforcement, and increased turnover. The recommended option optimizes space usage and reduces hiring and training costs by improving employee satisfaction and retention. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, while option 1 enforces compliance and promotes in-person collaboration, its effectiveness is questionable as it may negatively impact morale, engagement, and productivity. For instance, compliance with the common hybrid work model at ESTC is currently below 60%, which is the required threshold. In contrast, our recommended option takes a phased approach, allowing for role-based flexibility, which supports retention and improves overall productivity. Regarding equity, option 1 fails to accommodate diverse employee needs, disproportionately affecting caregivers, those with health concerns, and those with long commutes. The recommended option ensures fairness by tailoring work arrangements and fostering an inclusive workplace. In terms of feasibility, option 1 presents significant implementation challenges, including defining role classifications, inconsistent departmental execution, legal risks, and union pushback. The enforcement of the social media policy further complicates matters, as employees have taken to online platforms to express their dissatisfaction with the RTO directive, creating reputational risks for the department. While a recommended option is more practical, it still requires proper role assessments and consistent execution across departments. Overall, the option 2 is the recommended approach as it balances compliance with flexibility, reduces risks, and promotes a sustainable, equitable transition while minimizing reputational risks associated with social media backlash. Now I'll let Neha talk about the implementation plan for a recommended approach.
Thanks, Komal. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the timelines for implementation of option 2, which is our recommended option. We propose that the Social Media Guidelines Committee works for over 2 months, March and April, and release the guidelines with a structured staff training program facilitated by a third-party agency. Simultaneously, the planned in-depth review of classified positions will begin in March and continue until the next 6 months. ESTC's Human Resource Services branch, led by the Assistant DM, will be heavily involved in this process, along with team managers and supervisors of different divisions. In June, the management and executives return to office for 4 days a week, followed by the return of rest of the staff starting in September and extending up to December. This plan will ensure a structured approach to ethical social media usage and a phased return to the workplace. I will ask Jeremy to wrap up the presentation.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Neha. This presentation served to inform the ESDC's Senior Management Committee of the immediate, short, and medium-term implications of the Treasury Board's Annex 1 directives. This problem is multifaceted, involving challenges to both workforce and workplace policy to reflect public service value changes. Human nature encourages adaptation when faced with a change in our environment. COVID-19 triggered adaptation to our workplace environment, as well as highlighted shifting values in the public workforce. Incorporating ethical space theory into the delivery of these directives, as well as providing leadership teams with robust human resources tools, will allow for a proactive, guided return to office mandate. The internal consistency and unified approach of our recommendation will reestablish the ESDC workplace as one that places the effective delivery of public services at the forefront of employee values. The structured framework this provides to leadership teams will also improve the research and development of the hybrid work model to ensure that Canada's public servants are leading the way in the modernization of public service infrastructure. We would now like to open the floor to any questions or comments our panel has, including a review of the criteria that we evaluated. I believe there was a technical error and you were unable to see that slide. So we would like to open the floor to your questions, and thank you again in considering the RTO Implementation Committee's proposal. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. You're the first team we have from out west, and it is wonderful to have you with us. And it was really enlightening and very encouraging to see how well you did in with the task assigned to you and how well you worked together. And I want to really thank you for a week well spent on preparing this presentation and all the complications. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Stefania to talk about how we measure all this.
Great. Thank you, Noah, and thank you for the presentation. So yeah, my question is around implementation and what you face, what you anticipate you will face with implementing your proposed plan. So what do you think is going to be some of the easier wins that you can achieve through implementing the plan, and what do you expect is going to be more challenging?
Thank you for your question. I'm going to call upon Neha to answer this one, please.
Yeah, thank you. We think overall implementation of option 2 will not be very challenging because of the staggered approach that we are proposing. The managers and executives return first, they finalize all the review process, conduct in-depth classification, and then the results are communicated to the employees. Challenging part could be directing the employees who are supposed to report to regional locations, the various timelines. But this can be overcome through coherent and clear communications and being transparent about the processes that are taking place in the division that are being conducted by the HR services branch. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up. I noticed that one of your annexes speaks to measuring success in implementation, KPIs and metrics. Do you want to speak to that slide just briefly?
Yeah, sure. Can we go on to that slide, please?
Can you provide the number for the Neha?
Slide 14.
I can go ahead and answer that question too.
Sure. Go on.
Okay, so our KPIs focus on both quantitative and qualitative metrics to provide a comprehensive evaluation. Quantitative measures such as productivity rates, time to process transactions, and cost savings help assess operational efficiency. Meanwhile, qualitative factors such as employee engagement, job satisfaction, and workplace culture ensures that human and ethical considerations are not overlooked. These KPIs allow for data-driven decision-making while considering broader organizational goals. Metrics like absenteeism and turnover rates can also serve as indirect indicators, as a satisfied and engaged workforce tends to be more stable and productive. Finally, IT and system analytics can track workflow progress and digital activity to assess work patterns in hybrid and remote settings. Together, these measures provide a comprehensive approach to evaluating productivity beyond just physical presence in the office. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to pass it over to my other committee colleague, Michael, to talk about the role of the public service.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Very, very well done. Getting to the social media directive, the core of the issue, it seems to me, for people of my generation who entered the public service about 100 years ago, actually in the mid-'80s, there was a fairly clear deal that public servants made with their employer, and that was, we understood that nonpartisan public service was integral to government and our system of government. And that basically meant that public servants weren't to engage in public partisan conversations. And the logic behind this was, the deal was, by not doing so, we retained the faith of whichever government got elected by Canadians, that we would faithfully implement their agenda, and that we didn't have our own agenda. And so that was sort of a fundamental piece, and that mattered a lot to my generation of public servant. More recently, with the new recruits into the government of Canada, that onboarding and that conversation and that culture hasn't been emphasized as much. And so social media, which is omnipresent, it's ubiquitous, it's available to everyone, is very tempting for public servants to engage through. I guess the question I would pose is, has the deal changed? And as you think through implementation of the social media directive, is there a persuasive argument behind what I've just shared? How does it influence the way in which you would approach that?
Yes, thank you for your question. I'm going to take half of this and I will pass this back over to Neha to address the second half. I think you're right with the new implementation of social media. There is that ability to kind of express your views more readily. But I think that is one of the great things about our solution. That code of conduct that we signed going in prevents it, as well as that social media training through Knowledge Academy. So by kind of mediating and teaching people about ethical social media use within governance, we can really teach some of these young employees who might have not had experience in terms of not sharing everything online. So I'm going to call back to Neha to explain the second half of the social media approach.
Thank you, Sebastian. And I would like to say that, yes, there has been a generational shift and technological shift that has sort of changed values among public servants. Considering ESTCs, our workforce is quite young. Like, we have 60% of staff that is under the age of 30. So I think there is really a need of uniform guidelines that they can go through, and these guidelines should be easy to read and, more importantly, easy to understand, because for millennials, going through old documents that were drafted 10 or 20 years ago, I feel the language is sometimes a little confusing and ambiguous. So having clear guidelines that can be understood well, that enhance clarity, and if they can be supplemented by some additional resources, for example, some FAQs or some training slides or imaginary social media scenarios and discussion questions. So this would help the staff to navigate some of the real life situations that they come on social media. So overall, I think it is more about making or communicating to staff, trying to help them understand the issues that can arise out of unethical social media usage. They're all here willing to listen, but I think there is a lack of uniform guidelines that is probably cause of concern.
I think I'll just add to my team's comments there that this was what I had intended to convey in the initial presentation portion, where it's just more of a shift based on the COVID-19, like away from an office environment. So those values are still there. I think people just need to be repositioned and refocused on them once they're back in front of employees, kind of visual and repositioned as primary to public service. I think it'll be a pretty obvious solution for them to just adopt the kind of founding principles and key competencies to working in the public service.
Could I ask one follow-up question, Noah?
Yeah.
So not directly related to the subject we've just been dealing with. It's more about the relocation interests that the minister has in terms of relocating public servants closer to the remote communities that they serve. And I just wanted to ask you, I may have missed it, but I don't think I heard you speak too much to relocation issues as part of your presentation. How does that play in this strategy and the implementation of the game plan? And what are some of the considerations that you gave to relocation as a fundamental part of this overall strategy?
Thank you for your follow-up question. I'm going to give this one back to Jeremy to speak on.
Thanks, Sebastian. By employing that ethical space theory that incorporates Indigenous perspectives, that's a core value to Indigenous community building and work in the public service, is to have that face-to-face interaction. So through collaboration with existing ESDC Indigenous specialists who are award-winning in this area, that's the phased approach's intention, is to kind of assess things on a needs-based approach, and anyone or any jurisdiction that benefits more from having that return to office kind of location focused approach, that's where we'd be heading with that, is that based on their assessment in the interview process by their management teams, they would get to decide where it was more and less relevant based on the communities and the needs of those communities.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I love the idea of millenniums having to read, way back policies from the 2010s. I totally cool. I can see it in my mind. Guy, you have a question?
Thanks. If you saw me, thank you very much for your very strong presentation. If you saw me going back and forth as you were presenting, I was going back to the sort of the case description, and you were asked to comment on the implementation of the directive, including whether you thought there were things that couldn't be implemented and how you would approach that, arguments for and against it. And as I understand your presentation, you've looked at straightforward implementation and a slightly phased approach, which just changes the timeframes. My question is, did you consider but not put in the presentation other methods of implementing the directive, or just the two we see, which is the timeframe proposed by Treasury Board and a slightly modified timeframe?
Thank you for your question. That's excellent. I'm going to ask Kamal to touch on this.
Thank you for the question. Can I ask Neha to answer this question, please?
So yeah, I would take that. So yes, we have just considered these two implementation approaches, one being a uniform approach of returning to office on a particular date, and the other being a staggered approach, because we feel that the staggered approach will meet the objectives that the Treasury Board has outlined in a way that is least disruptive and least cost and most efficient, we would say.
But just a supplementary on that, like social media is also part of this. There's a sort of a delay to rethink things. Have you considered whether the output would be that some communications on social media would be permitted and others wouldn't? Like I'm just trying to get a sense of what whether you're proposing a varied implementation or just a delayed or phased implementation.
For social media, we are proposing to have guidelines as soon as possible. So we are proposing a time frame of 2 months, so that managers, so that the staff has time to go through those guidelines and conduct training workshops. So the idea is to have social media guidelines as soon as possible. So that's why we have recommended like a shorter time frame of 2 months, and then the managers and executives, they conduct the in-depth reviews of all classified positions, and depending upon results of those review process, we call back the employees starting from September to December, depending upon their location, requirements, operational requirements of the role, and their experience and recruitment complexities.
Thank you.
I would just like to add quickly, because we're running low on time, our first option does address the gap that was created in the existing policy for social media that's only monitoring government devices. We're including that code of conduct and surrounding theory on social media management to capture those personal devices and hopefully align public servants with that overarching values that we're trying to see on both platforms.
And thank you very much, team, for your advice. We have other presentations, of course, but welcome everything that you had to offer.